The moment Daniel Reyes stepped into the war room, every alien in the chamber turned to stare. Not with curiosity, but with contempt. He felt their eyes on him, cold, dismissive, amused. Some sneered. Others didn't bother acknowledging his presence at all. In the vast halls of Zaltor Military Academy, where the finest warriors of the galaxy trained for war, a human cadet was nothing more than a cosmic joke. And Daniel Reyes was the punchline. He adjusted his uniform, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The chamber was a grand coliseum of holographic war tables, massive display screens, and elite cadets from species that had ruled the stars for centuries. The Thalzar, towering reptilian juggernauts bred for war. The Veltor, cold-eyed strategists with minds honed to perfection. The Kareen, multi-limbed tacticians who could process battle scenarios faster than any human AI. Daniel was the only representative of Earth. The only one who didn't belong. Look at it, a voice sneered in galactic common. The primate actually showed up. Laughter rippled across the room. A Thalzar cadet, easily 7 feet tall, stepped forward. His emerald scales gleamed under the war table's light, his armored tail swaying behind him. Thalzar Savir, top of his class, elite warrior, and Daniel's biggest obstacle. You should have stayed on your little dirtball, Savir rumbled, voice like grinding stone. This is no place for lesser beings. Daniel met his gaze, unreadable. Guess we'll find out. More laughter. Some of it was genuine amusement. Most of it was cruel. But one cadet, Kareen 12VA, a slender, 6-armed strategist with quicksilver eyes, tilted her head, watching him with interest. Before Savir could retort, a blaring chime cut through the tension. The trial of strategy was about to begin. Cadets, take your positions. Daniel took his seat at a command console, a sleek interface displaying a live battlefield simulation. The challenge was simple in theory: lead a squad of virtual troops against a superior alien force and survive for 20 minutes. Simple. But not for a human. The other cadets had been training for this since childhood. Their species had millennia of war experience encoded in their genes. Daniel? He had a few years at Earth's best military academies and a mind that refused to accept impossible. The simulation began. Holographic troops flickered into existence. His side was given a ragtag squad of under-equipped soldiers, while the enemy force was a full battalion of elite alien warriors. A massacre waiting to happen. Daniel exhaled. Adapt. Improvise. Overcome. The alien cadets executed their strategies with flawless precision, their forces moving in perfect coordination. The Veltor cadet relied on calculations, predicting enemy movements with terrifying accuracy. The Kareen used multitasking strategies, commanding multiple units at once. Savir? He overwhelmed his enemies with sheer brute force. Daniel saw the problem immediately. They were too perfect. Too predictable. He smirked. Time to play dirty. Instead of holding the line, Daniel retreated. His troops abandoned their forward position, falling back into a maze of ruined buildings. The alien cadets watching scoffed. He's already running. But Daniel wasn't running. He was setting a trap. He sent a small squad forward, bait. As expected, the enemy forces surged after them, eager for an easy kill. But just before they made contact, Daniel detonated the buildings around them. Debris collapsed, splitting the enemy formation in half. Gasps erupted around the chamber. The judges leaned forward. But Daniel wasn't done. With the enemy divided, he used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, misinformation. He exploited their predictability, their arrogance. The aliens fought like they always had, straightforward, powerful, rigid. Daniel fought like a human, unpredictable, ruthless, adaptable. Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. By the time the 20-minute mark hit, Daniel's forces still stood. He had won. Silence filled the chamber. Then, an explosion of chaos. Impossible, a Veltor strategist hissed. He cheated. Xavier snarled, slamming a fist onto the console. The instructors whispered among themselves. No human had ever survived the first trial, let alone outplayed the best cadets in the galaxy. Daniel stood, hands in his pockets. He met Xavier's furious gaze and gave him a small, infuriating smile. You were saying? As the cadet stormed from the room, Karine lingered, watching Daniel with something other than contempt. You don't fight like the others, she said. Daniel shrugged. Humans don't fight fair. A pause. Then, to his surprise, Karine smiled. From the shadows, an Academy official activated a concealed communicator. The human passed the first trial. Begin contingency protocols. Daniel Reyes had just made history, and now, the real war had begun. Daniel Reyes woke to the sound of alarms. Not the usual Academy chimes, but something sharper, urgent. Dangerous. He sat up instantly, instincts firing. His quarters were dim, illuminated only by the red glow of emergency lights. A notification flashed across his console. Mandatory trial, 0G combat. Report immediately. Daniel frowned. The second trial wasn't scheduled until next week. This was too soon. Too sudden. Someone was trying to break him. Good luck with that. He exhaled sharply, rolled out of bed, and suited up. The moment he stepped into the corridor, he noticed it. The Academy felt different. The usual background hum of distant conversations was absent. No laughter, no banter. Just silence. Then the whispers started. The human won't last 5 minutes. Xavier is going to destroy him. They're just putting him through this to humiliate him. Daniel ignored them. He had a test to pass. The 0G combat trial took place in the Void Sphere, a massive, anti-gravity chamber designed to simulate real space battles. No ground. No up or down. Just endless, shifting obstacles and no margin for error. The cadets floated in a circular formation, magnetic boots disengaged. Daniel's stomach tightened. 0G wasn't humanity's strong suit. Every other species here had evolved in multi-environment worlds. Some were natural floaters, others had built-in biological stabilizers. Daniel? He had duct tape and spite. At the center of the chamber, an instructor hovered before them. Commander Zell, a skeletal, insectoid Veltor, known for his complete lack of empathy. His multifaceted eyes scanned them, emotionless. Cadets, this is a live combat trial. Full contact. The last 3 standing will pass. The rest, Zell's mandibles clicked. Will not. Daniel's jaw tightened. No weapons. No safety nets. Just skill and survival. The moment the trial began, the aliens exploded into motion. Daniel launched himself off a floating platform, twisting in midair to avoid a Karine cadet who lashed out with 4 arms. He ducked, but another Veltor combatant came at him from the left. Think, Reyes. You're at a disadvantage. Make it their problem instead. Daniel reached out and grabbed the Veltor's arm, twisting his own momentum to redirect the alien into the incoming Karine. They collided hard, tumbling into a nearby structure. One down. A shadow loomed behind him, Xavier. Daniel barely managed to dodge as the Thalzar war cadet swung a devastating clawed fist at him. In 0G, force mattered more than speed, and Xavier knew it. His attacks were slow, but when they connected, they ended fights. Daniel flipped backward, pushing off a floating structure. He needed a weapon. Anything. His eyes flicked to the cadet ahead of him, Veltor Velkin, who had just retrieved a combat baton. Perfect. Daniel threw himself toward Velkin, arms wide as if to grapple. The Veltor instinctively swung his baton. But Daniel wasn't there. At the last second, he twisted, letting the strike pass inches from his side, and grabbed Velkin's wrist, stealing the baton right out of his grip. Velkin had just enough time to hiss in surprise before Daniel slammed the weapon into his helmet, sending him spiraling out of the trial zone. Only 4 remained: Daniel, a Kareen, a Thalzar, and, of course, Savir. The Kareen lunged at Daniel, but he was ready this time. He spun in midair, using her own momentum against her, and kicked her straight into an oncoming asteroid fragment. She yelped, lost control, and was eliminated. Then there were 3. Daniel turned, and Savir was already there. A massive arm grabbed him by the throat, slamming him into a floating barrier. Stars exploded in Daniel's vision. "You're done, primate," Savir growled. Daniel coughed, barely able to breathe. His baton floated inches away. If he could just... Savir squeezed harder. Daniel's vision darkened. Not like this. Think, Reyes. Then he saw it. The Thalzar's tail. It was wrapped around a floating support beam for stability. Daniel reached out, not for his baton, but for Savir's tail. Before the alien could react, Daniel yanked hard. Zero-G physics did the rest. Savir lost balance, his massive body twisting the wrong way. His grip loosened, just enough for Daniel to break free. Then, using the last of his strength, Daniel grabbed the baton and smashed it across Savir's head. The Thalzar spun wildly, arms flailing. His momentum carried him out of the trial zone. Aided, Daniel floated there, panting. Only 2 cadets remained. He had passed. The chamber was silent as the trial ended. Then, whispers. That was impossible. He took down Savir. How the hell did a human just win? Daniel wiped blood from his lip and smirked. He could already see the shock on the instructors' faces. They hadn't planned for this. He had survived 2 trials. Now the Academy knew the truth. Humans weren't weak. Humans weren't prey. Humans were a problem. The moment Daniel Reyes stepped out of the Zero-G combat arena, he knew he had made enemies. The corridors of Zaltor Military Academy were eerily quiet as he walked. The usual sneers and whispered insults were gone. Instead, he felt something worse, the weight of silent hostility. Eyes followed him from the shadows. Conversations halted when he passed. Even the cadets who had laughed at him before now regarded him with something else entirely. Fear. The galaxy had assumed that humans were weak. That they didn't belong in the ranks of interstellar warlords. Daniel had proven them wrong. And that was a problem. Inside the Grand War Chamber, a storm was brewing. The Academy's High Council, an assembly of generals, scholars, and diplomats from the galaxy's most powerful species, was not pleased. A Veltor official slammed a clawed fist onto the table. This is unacceptable. The human cadet should have been eliminated by now. Across from him, a Kareen instructor drummed her 6 fingers against the table, observing the proceedings with mild amusement. And yet, he is not. The question is, why? The Thalzar general, Commander Vrax, narrowed his reptilian eyes. Humans were admitted as a formality. A sign of goodwill. We never intended to grant them true status among the war academies. Then how, a deep voice rumbled from the shadows, do you explain that the human has bested your finest warriors? Silence. The speaker stepped forward, a massive, battle-scarred figure draped in dark combat armor. Supreme Commander Azar, one of the highest-ranking military strategists in the galaxy. Unlike the others, his expression held neither disdain nor amusement, only calculation. The human has survived 2 trials, Azar said. If he wins the 3rd, we will have no choice but to acknowledge Earth's potential. The Veltor scoffed. Then we ensure he does not. Daniel received his next test assignment later that night, slipped under his door in a sealed data slate. The next challenge will be a live battlefield simulation. You will command a vastly inferior force against a superior enemy. Victory is not expected. Do your best. Daniel stared at the words, his mind already piecing together what this meant. They were setting him up to fail. If he lost, it would confirm what the galaxy already believed, that humans weren't ready for war. If he won, they wouldn't let him win. The message was clear, this was not a test. This was an execution. The battlefield simulation chamber was a massive, sprawling war arena, a fully interactive holographic environment where cadets commanded armies in real time. Daniel stepped onto the raised platform, facing his opponents, Xavier, now sporting a deep bruising from their last fight, a Veltor strategist named Vilek, and Karine 12VA, the only cadet who hadn't openly ridiculed him. The instructors loomed overhead in a glass observation deck. This wasn't a trial anymore. This was a spectacle. The rules were simple. Daniel's army, 500 under-equipped, low-tier infantry. Enemy force, 10,000 elite war troops, fully supplied. Objective, survive for 30 minutes. Impossible. Daniel exhaled. Not impossible. Just unfair. The simulation began. The enemy moved fast, a crushing wave of troops spreading across the battlefield. The other cadets deployed textbook-perfect strategies, advancing with overwhelming force. Daniel, however, did the one thing none of them expected. He didn't fight. He disappeared. Instead of engaging the enemy head-on, he ordered his forces into hidden ravines, ruins, and underground tunnels, abandoning traditional battle lines. The enemy expected a frontal assault. Instead, they found nothing but empty fields and ghost signals. Xavier growled. "What is this nonsense?" "He's stalling," Vilek muttered, eyes flicking across the war map. "Cowardice." 12VA, however, tapped a finger against the console, intrigued. "No, he's waiting." She was right. Daniel's troops struck from the shadows, hitting supply lines, sniping key officers, then vanishing before retaliation could arrive. The enemy's numbers still dwarfed his, but chaos spread through their ranks. They were used to overwhelming force. They were not used to a human war. Guerrilla warfare. Psychological tactics. Misdirection. Minute by minute, Daniel stalled the clock. His forces moved like ghosts, never engaging in direct conflict, always luring the enemy into traps and diversions. At 20 minutes, panic started to ripple through the alien ranks. At 25 minutes, the cadets watching realized something horrifying. He was going to make it. Inside the observation deck, the High Council watched in grim silence. "This is unacceptable," the Veltor official spat. "Terminate the simulation." "No," Azir said, watching the screen intently. "Let it finish." The timer hit 28 minutes. Daniel's forces were down to the last 100 men. He had 2 minutes left to survive. That was when the simulation was hacked. The battlefield flickered, and suddenly, an extra enemy fleet materialized out of thin air. Daniel's eyes widened. This wasn't part of the test. Someone had changed the rules. A fleet of aerial warships descended, wiping out his remaining forces in seconds. The simulation ended. Defeat. Daniel ripped off his headset, furious. They had cheated. The crowd erupted in laughter. Xavier smirked. "Looks like you're not so clever after all, human." Daniel clenched his fists. Every instinct told him to fight back, to shout the truth, but he forced himself to stay calm. Then a voice spoke from behind him. That was a rigged trial. Daniel turned. Karine 12VA stood there, arms crossed. Her silver eyes were unreadable. "You saw it too?" Daniel asked. She nodded. "The others will pretend they didn't, but I know what I saw." Daniel exhaled. This wasn't over. They had changed the rules, stacked the deck, tried to break him. But they had made one mistake. They had made him angry. And humans fought best when they were angry. Daniel Reyes should have been dead. The dagger missed his throat by an inch. He twisted, adrenaline spiking, grabbing the attacker's wrist and slamming it into the steel wall of his quarters. The blade clattered to the ground. His assailant, a masked figure clad in a stealth suit, lashed out with a second strike. Daniel barely dodged. This wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a test. This was an assassination. The figure lunged again. Daniel reacted on instinct, ducking under the attack, grabbing a chair and slamming it into his attacker's ribs. The assassin staggered. That was all the opening he needed. With a brutal pivot, Daniel swept the legs out from under them and drove his knee into their chest, pinning them to the ground. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The assassin gave no response. No hesitation. No fear. Instead, they activated a self-terminating neural implant. Daniel barely had time to roll away as the assassin convulsed, body locking up, eyes turning vacant. A second later, they were dead. Daniel stood, chest heaving. His mind raced. This was no rogue cadet. This was an execution order. Someone in the academy wanted him gone. And they had just failed. 12 hours later, Daniel stood before the assembled cadets in the Hall of Trials. Despite the attempted assassination, the academy hadn't changed course. The next trial was still happening. And it was the most brutal one yet. Commander Zell, the insectoid Veltor instructor, addressed the cadets from the towering podium above. "Combat is only half the battle," Zell's voice clicked through the air. "True warriors survive in the harshest conditions. Today's trial will determine if you are worthy of the battlefield or if nature itself will cull you." The war map activated. A planet appeared on the central display. VX-981. A Class 4 death world. A planet so hostile that even its oxygen was a weapon, filled with toxic spores, megafauna predators, and an unstable, shifting landscape. Daniel's gut twisted. The mission: survive for 72 hours. No weapons. No armor. No supplies. No rules. The drop pods slammed into the surface of VX-981 like meteor impacts. Daniel stumbled out, coughing as thick, acrid air filled his lungs. His suit's filters worked overtime, but even then, he could feel the burn in his throat. The terrain was nightmarish. Jagged cliffs, flesh-eating plants, and a sky that rained acidic mist. In the distance, something roared, a deep, guttural sound that made his bones vibrate. The other cadets were already scattering. Some tried to form alliances. Others immediately turned predatory. Daniel knew how this worked. This wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a war zone. Daniel moved fast. He didn't go for shelter. Shelter was a trap. Instead, he searched for high ground, an escape route, anything that gave him an advantage. By nightfall, he had a plan. He had observed 3 primary threats. The environment: the air was poisonous in some regions. Certain plants released spores that could shut down neural functions. The ground itself was unstable, hiding sinkholes that swallowed creatures whole. The wildlife: massive, 6-limbed predators roamed the terrain. Daniel watched as one alien cadet got too close to a nesting area. The result was quick and messy. The other cadets, the real threat. Daniel saw 2 groups forming, one led by Thalzar Savir, using brute force to eliminate competitors, and another led by Veltor Vilek, using deception and ambush tactics. Both would be coming for him soon. He needed to strike first. By the second day, half the cadets were gone. Daniel had spent the night setting traps, using what little resources he had. He crafted makeshift snares, primitive spike pits, and environmental hazards. When Savir's hunting group came for him, they walked straight into a false trail, one that led them into an area filled with burrowing insectoids. The screams lasted 3 minutes. That left Vilek's team. Daniel found them at dusk. They had set up a fortified position, using the wreckage of an old escape pod as a defensive structure. Smart. But not smart enough. Daniel didn't attack head-on. He lured in a pack of native predators instead. As the creatures attacked, Daniel picked them off one by one from the shadows. By the end of the second night, he was one of the last 5 cadets standing. The morning of the final day, only 2 survivors remained. Daniel and Savir. The Thalzar wasn't just alive, he was thriving. His reptilian physiology gave him natural resistance to the toxins. He had raw strength, endurance, power. But Daniel? Daniel had something better. Strategy. The two met in the clearing of a dead forest, the sun burning through the mist. Xavier grinned, his claws gleaming. This time, no tricks, human. Just strength against strength. Daniel rolled his shoulders. Strength isn't the only way to win a fight. Xavier lunged, a blur of muscle and claws. Daniel dodged. Barely. The Thalzar was faster than he expected. Every blow was a kill strike. Daniel couldn't win in a straight fight. So he didn't. Instead, he baited Xavier forward into the heart of a spore field. The Thalzar stopped, confused, then his eyes widened as he realized. The air shimmered with a fine, invisible neurotoxin. Xavier coughed once. Then collapsed. Daniel stood over his fallen opponent, watching as the Thalzar's muscles locked up, unable to move. I told you, Daniel said, stepping past him. Strength isn't everything. The trial was over. Daniel Reyes had survived. And now, the galaxy had no choice but to take humans seriously. Daniel Reyes stood at the summit of Zaltor Military Academy's highest observation deck, watching the stars stretch into infinity. He had survived the impossible. And now, the galaxy wanted him dead for it. Surviving the trial of survival had made him infamous. The cadets whispered his name with a mix of awe and resentment. Some wanted to challenge him. Others wanted him gone. But it wasn't just the cadets. The High Council had convened behind closed doors, their decision looming like a storm on the horizon. A human had beaten their best. That was something they could not allow. The academy was divided. Some instructors, like the pragmatic Commander Azar, saw potential in humanity. Others, like the furious Veltor strategists, saw Daniel's victories as an insult to millennia of military superiority. So they devised a solution. A final test. A public duel. A spectacle that would end the debate once and for all. Daniel Reyes versus Thalzar Xavier. A fight to the death. The combat coliseum was the size of a city. Thousands of spectators, students, officers, and galactic diplomats had gathered to witness the event of the century. Daniel stepped into the arena, his uniform modified for combat. He had been given a choice of weapon. He chose a single-edged tactical blade, a human weapon, forged for speed and precision. Across from him, Xavier emerged from the shadows. He was larger than before, his green scales repaired from their injuries, his clawed fists wrapped in reinforced combat gauntlets. The Thalzar race was bred for war. Even unarmed, they were lethal. Armed, they were unstoppable. The duel was designed to be unfair. Daniel had no intention of playing fair. A deep voice echoed across the Colosseum as Supreme Commander Azar raised a hand. Begin. Xavier moved first. Fast. Brutal. Precise. Daniel barely dodged as a clawed fist tore through the space where his head had been. The force of the blow sent a shockwave rippling across the arena sand. Daniel pivoted, rolling to the side. He knew better than to go on the defensive. He had to control the fight. He feinted left, then struck low, his blade slicing at Xavier's knee joint. The Thalzar roared in pain. The crowd gasped. Daniel didn't stop. He pressed forward, his blade moving in a blur. Humans didn't have claws or natural armor, but they had speed, adaptability, and strategy. Xavier recovered fast. Too fast. The Thalzar lunged, grabbing Daniel's arm mid-swing. A mistake. Daniel twisted his wrist, dislocating Xavier's thumb in a fluid motion. The alien roared in pain as Daniel wrenched free and drove his knee into Xavier's ribs. Blood splattered across the sand. Daniel breathed hard, his muscles burning. Xavier was wounded, but he was still standing. Still dangerous. The Thalzar grinned, wiping blood from his jaw. You fight well, human. Daniel didn't answer. He was too busy calculating. Reading Xavier's patterns. Finding an opening. Xavier charged again. Daniel sidestepped, but too slow. A clawed hand caught his shoulder, and pain exploded down his side. Daniel hit the ground, rolling just in time to avoid a crushing stomp. Xavier was stronger, tougher, more resilient. But he wasn't smarter. Daniel had one final move left. As Xavier moved in for the finishing blow, Daniel did the unexpected. Instead of dodging, he charged forward. The Thalzar's eyes widened just before Daniel used his own weight against him, flipping over his shoulder and slamming him into the ground. A human had just thrown a Thalzar. The crowd went silent. Daniel stood over his fallen opponent, blade pressed to Xavier's throat. He had won. Xavier stared up at him, chest heaving. Then, slowly, he laughed. "You had the kill," Xavier rasped. "Why didn't you take it?" Daniel stepped back. "Because humans don't just kill to prove a point." The arena exploded with noise. Some cadets cheered. Others jeered. The High Council? They were speechless. Daniel Reyes had just done something no one had expected. He hadn't just won the duel. He had won the respect of his greatest enemy. Hours later, Daniel stood in the shadows of the observation tower, watching the city lights below. He wasn't sure what came next. Would they accept humanity now? Would they exile him? He didn't know. But then, footsteps echoed behind him. Daniel turned and saw Xavier. The Thalzar warrior nodded. "You're a warrior, Reyes. Not just a human. A warrior." Daniel exhaled. "So that means I belong here?" Xavier smirked. "You always did." For the first time since he had arrived at the academy, Daniel Reyes realized something. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for humanity's place among the stars. And this was only the beginning. Daniel Reyes was still breathing. And that meant he was still a threat. The duel should have been the end of him. That had been the Council's plan, to let Xavier crush him in a public spectacle, to remind the galaxy that humans were weak. But now, the plan had backfired. He had won. And worse, he had gained their respect. Now, Zaltor Military Academy, the most prestigious war institution in the galaxy, was faced with a dilemma. What do you do with a species that refuses to lose? The Grand War Chamber was in chaos. The High Council, representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species, sat in their towering seats, debating the impossible. A Veltor official slammed his clawed hand on the table. "This human's continued presence is an insult. He is a fluke, an anomaly. Humanity does not deserve a place among the stars." Commander Azar leaned forward, his massive frame draped in dark warlord robes. His deep voice cut through the noise like a blade. "An anomaly?" He gestured to the holoscreen, replaying Daniel's victories. "He has survived every test. He has beaten our finest. He has outmaneuvered, outlasted, and outplayed us. Tell me, Council, if this is what humanity produces as a mere cadet, then what would they become if we let them thrive?" Silence. The thought was terrifying. For centuries, the galaxy had viewed Earth as a backwater planet, useful only for its resources, unworthy of its place in military affairs. Now, they weren't so sure. A Kareen tactician finally spoke, her silver eyes unreadable. "If we allow humans into the academy, we are changing galactic law. Are we prepared for that?" The Veltor official hissed. "We should crush them now before they become a problem later." Azar's gaze darkened. "Or, we could make them an ally instead of an enemy." Daniel stood in the center of the chamber, facing the council. He could feel the weight of the moment, the staring eyes of an entire galaxy upon him. They could exile him. They could erase his records, pretend this never happened. Or they could acknowledge what they had been too blind to see, that humanity had earned its place. Azar rose. "Cadet Reyes," he said, "you have proven that humanity is not to be ignored." He looked around the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one spoke. Azar turned back to Daniel. By the authority of this council, Earth is no longer a minor species. You are now recognized as a military power. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Daniel exhaled, his fingers tightening at his sides. He had done it. Humanity had won. But Azur wasn't finished. "There's one final matter," he said. "Your future." Daniel frowned. "My future?" Azur nodded. "You are more than just a cadet now. You are the first of your kind to stand at the same level as the galaxy's finest. And that means you have a choice." He gestured to two paths. One, return to Earth as a hero. Your people will honor you, your legacy secure. Or two, remain here. Continue your training. Let humanity's rise from the inside. But if you choose this, understand, the trials will not end. The war to earn respect will never stop. Daniel already knew his answer. He had never been fighting just for himself. He had been fighting for every human who would come after him. "I stay," he said. Azur smiled. "Then welcome to the galactic elite, Reyes." The announcement shook the galaxy. Some celebrated. Some protested. Some plotted in the shadows. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time in history, humans were acknowledged as warriors. As equals. As threats. And Daniel Reyes? He had become something more than a cadet. He had become the beginning of a legend. As he stepped out of the war chamber, Karine 12VA fell and stepped beside him. "You realize what you've just done, don't you?" she murmured. Daniel smirked. "Yeah. You've put a target on your entire species." Daniel glanced at her. "Good." He turned his gaze toward the stars. "Let them come." Humanity was ready.